仲間ってのは隠し事なんかなしなんでしょ。お前は仲間なんかじゃない。
Just ignore the fact that almost all of y'all, including yourself, Rena, have a lot to hide. Yeah, a recurring thing I really started to notice as I was making this list was the fact that the majority of characters in this series have a lot of dirty laundry. Not that I find it to be a bad thing, as of course it adds an interesting layer to them, it's just a pattern I started to notice. But yeah, for today, we're going to take a look at my favorite Higurashi no Naku characters. We'll analyze them a little bit, and try to figure out what exactly makes them tick, while hopefully not going crazy ourselves in the process. I'll judge a character mostly by their personality, significance to the overarching plot, and of course, my own personal tastes. And unlike the arc ranking video I did at the beginning of this month, I'm not going to restrict myself to just the original 8 Q&A arcs for material, which will allow me to analyze certain characters deeper, as well as of course bring in some lesser known characters from outside the original 8. That said, I won't bring up other series canon like Umineko, so don't expect to see any of those guys. Don't worry, your guys' time will come eventually. Also, just ignore the fact that Featherin, as well as likely some other Umineko characters, might appear in the 2020 series. Anyway, let's just take a look at my seasonally appropriate top 13 Higurashi no Naku characters. Now, don't get me wrong, I think Akasaka is awesome. He's a great family man, and played one of the biggest factors in finally breaking Rika free of her time loop. But, the more I reflected upon it, the more I realized he's kinda bland. Unlike pretty much everyone else on this list, he just doesn't have any real hidden depth to him. I've already mentioned how I found his debut arc to be my least favorite in the entire series, partially because he just didn't do much of anything other than play mahjong and help build up Rika's importance to the story. Then in his next appearance in the Minagoroshi hand, he was just meant to build up false hope, as just as soon as he showed up, he then went off with his family to the spa.
To the spa?
To the spa!
All that said, I still did really like the ending to the Himatsubushi hand with him basically becoming Ryukishi Reina, and then of course came the Matsuri Bayashi hand, which really, all I need to do is show this. Well, that and this, god that is heartwarming. So while he does kind of lack in personality, at least compared to some of his co-workers, who we will get to, Mamoru Akasaka does make up for it for his role in the story, his cute relationship with Rika that also gave us one of the funniest scenes in the manga, and of course, that Falcon Punch. And now, here's our first character that not everyone's going to know about, and therefore I'm going to have to provide a slightly longer analysis, Natsumi Kimiyoshi, though you might recognize that surname. Yep, Natsumi is related to Kiichiro, the guy who probably should have chosen his words a little better when he was sitting next to the crazy little green-headed psychopath. That'll have a bit of an ironic echo in just a little bit. But anyway, Natsumi originally appeared in the only Sarashi Hand, or Demon Exposing arc, a manga exclusive story that I thought was okay. I mean, it's understandable, as it was meant to be a very self-contained story that would have no real significant impact on the larger canon. To give a quick summary, it was mostly the story of Natsumi's family slowly falling apart after the Hinamizawa disaster occurred in their timeline. Supposedly, her grandmother went nuts over the idea that Oyashiro-sama's curse would come for them, which then led to her mother going crazy, and before you know it, Natsumi was an orphan. However, much like many a Higurashi story, this quickly got overturned by the end, as evidence suggested Natsumi was the actual culprit behind all of her family's deaths. Unsurprisingly, she had succumbed to the freaking Hinamizawa syndrome, and much like Keiichi, turned out to be an unreliable narrator. Though, unlike Keiichi, she survived thanks to the efforts of her new boyfriend, Akira, who did everything to ensure she got a happy ending, including taking the fall for her. Which, yeah, considering that she offed her entire family, that seems like an overly happy ending, which was thankfully corrected in the Kizuna games. The Kizuna games were the Nintendo DS ports of the visual novel adaptation of Higurashi, and their first game in the line, Tatai, featured the Some Utsushi Hen, which was basically the only Sarashi Hen, except much better. Not only did it significantly expand Natsumi's character and motivations for committing the murders, but also her supporting cast, including the aforementioned Akira and her friends Chisato and Tamako. As a result, we could really come to understand why she would succumb to the syndrome, with much of it stemming from the pressures of trying to hide her country bumpkin roots. To be exact, they had recently moved from Okunimiya, the place where the Angel Wart is, but her heritage was still with Hinamiza, which, yeah, I don't think a lot of people would willingly admit to. And her syndrome got far worse in this timeline, to the point that she even developed a demonic split personality. The arc would then end with her getting an itchy neck, and yeah, you know the rest. Natsumi's story would actually continue for about another arc or two. In the Kageboshi Hen's timeline, she still committed the murders, but was saved from her clawing fate by Chisato, who, by the way, earns an honorable mention just for being a fun character, yet also being strong enough to pacify her crazed friend. And then she finally achieved her true happy ending in the Miyotsukushi Hen, which was a timeline where the club managed to prevent the disaster, and thus her life didn't spiral out of control and she didn't kill off her family. She did have to deal with the hanging plot thread of her split personality, which somehow traveled across the timelines with the memories of each of those lines because why not at this point? Jeez, between this and Steingate Zero, they're getting pretty ridiculous with all of their time travel shenanigans. Anyway, she did ultimately defeat it and finally found peace within herself. Overall, Natsumi is a pretty interesting character, mostly thanks to her story arc and themes. Her suffering was the result of the heritage that she tried to hide and the mass media. She just didn't want to be seen as a girl from a backwater village, much less one that the news was portraying as a horrible, almost cult-like group. Bit of a timeless tale, ain't it? But yeah, it does give her a great wooby factor, as we do want to see her eventually overcome it all and achieve happiness. As for the reasons why she's not higher on this list in spite of having a great and surprisingly relevant tale is 1. She's a far less proactive character in this franchise. Often she needed others like Akira, Chisato, and another character who we'll get to in just a little bit to help her defeat her literal inner demons. Demon Natsumi was also a pretty interesting character, coming off as a bit of a criminal mastermind, though that also brings up the issue of her coming off as a little derivative of another green-haired yandere who does have a much longer tenure in this franchise. I mean, I do think she has enough unique traits that I do consider to be different enough from Shion, so with all that in mind, I do think this little schizophrenic earns the 12th spot on my list. Also, am I the only one who would have liked to see more interactions between her and Rika just for the Nanoha connections? Yes, of course, the main villain of the series had to be on this list. Whether or not she'll maintain that title in the sequel remains to be seen, but for the original 8 arcs, Takano was an enjoyably evil bitch. She'll manipulate her way to the top and even defy the gods, all for the sake of proving her grandfather Hifumi's thesis correct. Yeah, it's almost admirable that she did all of this just for the sake of an old man who, quite frankly, was a bit of a crackpot. I mean, yeah, he was right about there being a Hinamizawa syndrome, but several of his theories were proven incorrect, and yet he never seemed to consider revising his stuff because he was so fixated on achieving godhood instead of worrying about the practicality of his research. Really, it's no wonder his granddaughter turned out like this. Though that also, conveniently, leads into what I think is the most interesting aspect of this character, her crippling insecurity. Yes, more than her underhanded agendas, the thing Takano tries to hide the most was the fact that deep down, she was still pretty much that little girl named Miyoko Tanashi who had been abused by her over-the-top evil caretakers at the orphanage. Thus, she puts on the facade of a domineering woman who never relents, which of course led her to becoming a genocidal maniac. All of this just to deny her still very much lingering fears and insecurities from everyone, including herself. Yet, they still continued to fester, even to the point where she started to believe that it was her fault that her grandfather's research was rejected, and that she should have just have died at the orphanage. But really, what else could she do at this point? She had come to the resolution to defy the gods themselves and take back at least some control in her life that had tragically been all taken away from her. However, in spite of all of her efforts, a part of her knew it was all futile and that she was being manipulated by Tokyo. A story from an official anthology manga pretty much confirmed that nothing good awaited her in the world lines where she executed the disaster, and by the end, she just injected herself with the very disease her grandfather thought he had created the perfect thesis for. If that's not irony, I don't know what is. In the end, while I would never think of Takano as a sympathetic character, and in fact, I think she got off a little too easy because Tomitake is a simp, I still do find her to be a fascinating character. Plus, and I know they're not the same character, I'm speaking from a real world production standpoint here, without this crazy broad, we probably would have never gotten one of the best characters in Umineko. Just saying. Hands down, the best daddy in this whole series. I mean, granted, there's not a lot of competition, but still, I love this man and his fabulous facial hair, which is especially appropriate considering who his voice actor is. Yeah, you ever noticed ever since Gendo Ikari, Fumihiko Tachiki's characters have followed a certain pattern and often called back to the worst daddy? But yeah, typecasting aside, Kasai is such a badass. You can try and outnumber him and take him out with gas, but then he'll just take out a huge-ass shotgun and just blow a few dozen caps. As a result, he was kind of the unsung MVP of the Matsubashi Hen, as he managed to snipe the bad guy's tires from 400 meters away. Good god, this guy is OP. And yet through all of it, he mostly maintained a cool and collected cadence. Though when he wasn't cool or collected, probably make sure you have a clean pair of pants. However, likely because he was so overpowered, they didn't give him a lot of screen time, and he was mostly relegated to act as a satellite character for Shion. That said, I do really like the relationship between these two because, again, best daddy, as at one time, he did have a crush on Mrs. Sonozaki, and while he obviously didn't win that love triangle, he still remained loyal to her and became the bodyguard to her daughter, and really the better father figure for her as opposed to whoever this guy is. He even directly confronted Shion in an anthology chapter to calm her down after a misunderstanding involving Satoshi. Don't worry, he survived her yanderiness. As a result, you can totally understand why Shion would sacrifice a fingernail for him. I would give up my whole hand for this man. Also, in the Miyakashi Hen's tips, it was confirmed that Kasai actually passed away from liver cancer about 2 decades after that arc. Which is strange because in other world lines, he was shown to be perfectly healthy many years later. So that likely means he ruined his own liver with, yeah, losing Shion really affected the poor guy. So yeah, while he's far from the most plot-relevant character, Kasai makes it into my top 10 just for giving us the most badass version of Madao ever.
まるでダメなおっさん。略してマダオ。
Thus, we get our first club member on this list, and yeah, it's Sadako. Now, I don't think I dislike this character as much as others. I mean, yeah, I'm certainly not the biggest fan of her voice actress, as every time I hear her, I'm reminded of a certain gluttonous furry dog thing. But I do think she goes through some good character development over the course of the series. She started off as a bit of a haughty little brat who talked way too fancy for someone living in the boonies, but then we learned about her tragic backstory. A lot of it came from her parents being the only Hinamizawa residents who supported the dam project, and because mob mentality is a thing unfortunately, the whole family was ostracized, and the children got caught in the crossfire of a conflict their parents started. As a result, both Sadako and her brother Satoshi contracted the Hinamizawa syndrome, with Sadako's condition making her overly reliant on the latter. Though after he was taken away to get some intensive treatment, Sadako was forced to grow up a little, hence the overcompensating speech patterns. Thus, what initially came off as a bit of an annoying little quirk actually became a bit of a tragic trait, which is kind of common in this series, but I do think Sadako has one of the better justifications for it. From there, she became the center of some of the stronger storylines in the series, including the Minagoro Shihan, where the village finally managed to give up on their futile grudge with the Hojo family, and Sadako herself became a much stronger character thanks to many of her memories of previous world lines seemingly sticking. As a result, she was able to stand up against both Shion and Teppei, the former while she was about to die. And one of her best moments, in my opinion, came from the aforementioned Miyotsuku Shihan, where she finally managed to confront the biggest sin of her past, killing off her parents. From there, she accepted her role as a test subject for the Hinamizawa syndrome vaccine, and even managed to give up on her brother, who she realized she had made suffer with all of her neediness and wanted to give him the space to recover. All that said, I would say Sadako herself is the most fleshed out character of the club, as she'd often come off as more of a reactionary character, kind of like Natsumi, and would need the support of others. I mean, sure, she was vital in the takedown of the Yama-inu in the Matsubashi Hen, but that was also all kinds of ridiculous. I mean, seriously, her Home Alone-style traps managed to take down this trained military faction, including a Maksa from Umineko? Come on! Still, I do have to give credit where it's due, and do have to admit that she's an important part of the Higurashi series. I mean, at least her transformation into a magical girl made more sense than the Donut Fairy. And here, we get one of the best things to come out of the visual novel adaptations of Higurashi. This Mamoru Oshii character, who somehow found herself caught up in Hinamizawa's insanity, was introduced in the aforementioned Somei Utsushihen, replacing Oishi and Akasaka as the investigators who spoke directly with Natsumi. And unlike the good cop, bad cop duel, she actually formed a bit of a sisterly bond with her witness, probably thanks to the fact that she was an actual older sister to a fellow officer who she had a bit of an estranged relationship due to their past, but more on that later. Anyway, because of that bond, she was of course devastated when Natsumi finally succumbed to the Hinamizawa syndrome and she wasn't able to save her. This failure would carry over to other world lines where destiny would reunite the two a couple more times before she finally managed to help lead Natsumi to her true happy ending. Every time they would meet in a new world line, she would sympathize with Natsumi over the mass media's sensationalization of the Hinamizawa disaster, disregarding the feelings of those connected with that town. Again, I hate the fact that it remains so damn relevant these days. This was because she and her sister also suffered at the claws of the mass media vultures, who kept trying to interview them and anyone associated with them about a mysterious house fire that killed both of their parents. All of this because her father was an officer, and of course anything that sensationalizes possible police corruption sells papers. And yet, in spite of all of this, Tomoe essentially gave the middle finger to the vultures by becoming a cop herself, and even eventually apprehending the arsonist responsible for the fire in a high-speed chase that went all the way onto an airport runway. Yeah, if I have to explain any further why Tomoe is S-tier waifu material, I honestly don't know what to tell you. Well, I could also say she's full of personality, with some hilarious exchanges between her and Oishi, and her sister's boyfriend, Norio Wakamoto. Oh yeah, did you know this voice acting legend was in this series and he plays a police chief? Which, considering his previous occupation, yeah, that's just Wakamoto playing himself. But I digress. Tomoe, unfortunately, can't go any higher on this list because she was only introduced in the visual novels and therefore was completely absent for the original 8 story arcs, and as of the time of this recording, has not appeared in any anime adaptation so far. She did become very significant in the visual novel's interpretation of events, to the point even Hanyu recognized her as the missing Joker in their deck, who would unknowingly help move things in Rika's favor with the capture of that arsonist, who was heavily suggested to be working for Tokyo. But still, not everyone has played those games, so I can't really put her that much higher. Still, she's definitely one of my absolute personal favorites, and I'm holding out all hope that she appears in the 2020 anime, if anything. I mean, if a bunch of Umineko characters end up appearing in Go, and yet Inspector Minai hasn't gotten her time to shine yet, then I'll just say that is the greatest crime this series has ever committed. Keeping up this cops theme, let's move on to the character who's obviously based off of a certain well-known anime police officer. I mean, come on, he's an overweight cop voiced by Chopfreed. He is clearly meant to be a reference to Inspector Higure. Okay, no, obviously he's meant to be this series' version of Juzo Megure. And yet, in spite of not being a part of a manga that's almost 3 decades old at this point, Jesus, it's been going on that long? I would say Mr. Delicious is just as, if not more developed, than his fellow overweight cop. Starting off as one of the most morally gray characters in the series to the point you couldn't tell whether or not he was really a good guy or a bad guy, through his interactions with his fellow officers like Akasaka and Tomoe in the visual novels, we could soon see that he was just the biggest damn teddy bear ever. Not to say this old bear couldn't bite back, as he would also do anything to uncover the truth about Hinamizawa. His motivations for this are some of the strongest in the series in my opinion, for some connections to some real life events. Now, there are a plethora of reasons why Higurashi takes place in the 80s, stuff like the outdated setting, or the lack of some more refined forensic science. For Oishi, it was to accommodate his backstory because if you were to rewind the clock back about 40 years to his early adulthood years, you would get to the 1940s, which, yeah. As it turned out, he was a survivor of the 1942 Nagoya air raids, and like many during that time, he suffered heavily from survivor's guilt after losing family, in his case his father. He did find solace when he met a man who looked just like his father. However, even his surrogate father would be taken away from him, as he would end up becoming the foreman of the Hinamizawa Dam project, and yeah, that didn't work out so well. Thus, while Oishi would often put on the persona of an almost jolly-like Santa character, truth was, he was an embittered old man who constantly had to bite his tongue in order to move up the ranks in the police force and get enough authority to investigate Hinamizawa to find out the truth. And yet, by working within the bindings of an often corrupt and inherently broken system, he would be cut off from the truth and even die in several world lines. Though for him, even the latter would have been preferable, as he still had his survivor's guilt, and some of his co-workers like Tomoe in one timeline would be assassinated when they got too close to the truth. This would lead into, legitimately, one of the absolute best performances in the whole series, with Oishi just completely breaking down over this. In the end, he would eventually come to terms with the death of the foreman and make amends with Hinamizawa and its leaders. And from there, he became one of the most essential pieces in defeating Takano. So, for having a great personality, a very relatable backstory and arc, and yet still coming off as a total badass in spite of his age, Oishi gained some top honors from me. Yeah, no, if this guy hadn't retired, he would have been able to solve all of Conan's problems a lot quicker. Now, let me just make one thing very clear. I am a huge Mio and Keiichi shipper. I think they're just the cutest couple and have some of the best chemistry of the whole cast. I just want to say that because she's not in my top 5 and I really do wish she was, because she is just the nicest girl in this whole damn series. Yeah, you wouldn't initially think that of a total tomboy prankster like her, but by all standards, she is the most morally upright character in the series, to the point that, according to Rika, she is the only member of the club to never succumb to the Hinamizawa syndrome. Yeah, all of her friends and even her own twin have been infected in some timeline, and yet never herself, in spite of there being several timelines where she was physically and mentally tortured. There was even a timeline where it was heavily suggested that she survived being tortured by Shion, and yet she still didn't come down with the syndrome, just turned into a vegetable instead, unfortunately. But yeah, one of the reasons behind her high syndrome resistance might have come from the fact that she didn't have as much emotional baggage as her friends. Now, of course, that's not to say she didn't go through her own trials and tribulations before the series proper. The most obvious of these would of course be Satoshi. As while all of what happened to him was well out of her control, she still ultimately blamed herself for not being able to at least comfort him while he was at school. Thus, she resolved to ensure the safety of her remaining and new friends. This of course included ripping off her own fingernails just to make amends with her sister. That is dedication right there. I mean, Mion is just such a great person because she always tries to do right by everyone. This is likely due to the fact that, much like Takano, she is nowhere near as confident as she tries to make herself out to be, and thus overcompensates. Granted, in a much healthier and less genocidal way. But yeah, deep down, she's actually quite feminine and likely wishes she could be more like her twin if she didn't have to live up to the responsibilities of being the heir to the Sonozaki clan. Though, in a very cruel bit of irony, there was a time when she could have avoided all of these responsibilities. Yeah, as I mentioned in my last Higurashi video, this anime left out a crucial plot point about the twins in my opinion. The fact that their current names don't match up with their birth certificates. Yep, Mion is in fact the younger twin Shion, and vice versa with the current Shion. This came as a result of them pulling their twin antics one too many times, which resulted in the original Shion getting tattooed with an oni on her back. Yeah, the Sonozaki clan put a tattoo on the back of a young child. They're kind of messed up. And as a result, the twins were forever distinguished as the other. Now, of course, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to stick with their current names, but yeah, that's a heavy burden literally put on Mion's back. She knew she was living a lie that turned her sister into the unwanted child. And yet, in spite of all this, she would become the very competent leader of the club who pretty much guaranteed Rika's survival with her strategy and even kind of her brute force. Seriously, why wasn't this scene animated? In any other list, Mion might have been able to take the top spot, but since this is Higurashi, there are just some better characters who have more layers to them than being the kick-ass leader with a heart of pure gold. Still, that's quite the title that Mion more than earns, as well as the hand of Keiichi if he weren't so damn dense sometimes. Oh, how I pity the newcomers to this franchise whose first introduction to this demon loli was through the 2020 show's second episode just out of nowhere. I mean, for many of us, I think it was just such a great and hilarious twist that the almighty Oyashiro-sama turned out to be this character who was pretty much designed to be voiced by the same actress of Kano's Ayu. In general, Hanyu is just the cutest damn character in this whole series, with a lot of it coming from Yui Horie's great performance. Her interactions with Rika always get some of the biggest smiles and laughs from me. Granted, in her actual debut arc, she wasn't the most endearing character. Yeah, in spite of being an all-powerful deity, she never really did much in helping Rika break the time loops for about a century or so. She just had a really bad defeatist attitude, though after learning about her backstory, it becomes hard to blame her. As it turned out, she wasn't always a deity, but rather an actual living demon. Yeah, she wasn't totally human either, but was able to take on the form of one with horns, as she tried to act as a bridge between the two races, which wasn't an easy task as she couldn't hide her horns, and of course, humans have to have their prejudices and all that. Regardless, she was still able to get close to, and even married a goofy guy named Rika Furude, and they had a kid together. Yeah, don't let her current form fool you. Hanyu at one time was a mother with a daughter that looks and sounds a lot like Rika, but I'm sure that won't play into anything. However, her happy family life was doomed to tragedy, as not only would she be forced to kill Riku after he was possessed by another demon, her daughter Oka was captured by a bunch of greedy village leaders who wanted to use her for their own political gains. This drove Hanyu into an uncontrollable rage that could only be stopped by her own daughter. In her final moments, she accepted her fate, as at the very least it would result in peace between the villages that would eventually become Hinamizawa. As a result, she also became a deity, and many years later she would meet her descendant, Rika, and of course ended up treating her like her own daughter. However, she still couldn't get over what happened between her and Oka, and thus when it seemed like Rika's fate was inevitable, she just accepted it, but also tried to share as much time with her through the time loops. Obviously, she did eventually change her mind, and when she did, it led to one of my favorite moments in this series, as she outright challenged Takano to throw down by refusing her shrine donation, as if to say, I don't need your chump change. What I really liked about this was the fact that Hanyu was essentially replaying a scenario similar to the one from her past life. She was overtaking the operations of some corrupt leaders / politicians, spearheaded by someone who held a massive prejudice against her just because she looked a little different. However, in this scenario, she now had a renewed vigor, having seen how much humans were capable of changing their destinies. So, in spite of being a bit of a latecomer, only appearing in the final 2 arcs of the original 8, I think Hanyu's whole extended backstory is one of the most interesting in the series, with plenty of tragedy, and yet thankfully a happy ending, as she once again managed to experience motherhood, this time with Rika. Just don't look too much into the Miyotsukushi hand if you want to maintain that happy ending. I mean, that's good stuff too, but I do prefer the ending that led into the Kokoro Yashi hand. Oh jeez, this manga is way too wholesome for me. Just move on to the next one. Again, as much as I do like Nice Girl Mion, I have to admit her much more evil twin was the much more interesting character. First of all, she is arguably the best antagonist in this series, as unlike even Takano, she did get away with her crime, as she didn't have to answer to some clearly shady government guys. Her only literal slip-up came as a result of her own guilt and the Hinamizawa syndrome getting to her. Otherwise, she was a mastermind manipulator and liar that could pull off a perfect impersonation of her sister, and if all else failed, she had her ever-reliable taser on hand. God, I love this girl's style. However, while she did indeed become a total monster by the end of her 2 arcs, we could still feel a lot of sympathy for her. We already went over Mion's side of the permanent twin switch, but obviously, things were a lot harder for the former elder twin. On top of the loss of identity from forcibly losing her birth name, Shion also ended up losing a lot of her responsibilities and powers that she was gifted from birth. She did eventually somewhat come to terms with this, but still, understandably, wanted to seek independence from this family that just threw her into a boarding school that doesn't seem to have the best track record when it comes to their students. Thankfully, she did have people who were willing to help her achieve this, though not many. Thus, it's understandable she would fall for Satoshi in spite of the dude coming off as a bit of a plank of wood. He was one of the few people that showed her genuine kindness after living in a world that would abandon her at the drop of a hat. And after losing that one tie to a kinder world, of course she would
Go crazy?
Don't mind if I do!
Yet, while her actions in those world lines could never be forgiven, she would subconsciously seek atonement in others, where she did end up forming strong sisterly bonds with her most significant victim. Seriously, every scene between her and Sadako just warms my heart. Almost as much as her stuff with Kasai, because Kasai is awesome as we've already gone over. Still, for being the best antagonist, yet also a sympathetic monster, Shion just barely misses the top 3 for me, but I'll always consider her my personal favorite yandere ever. Seriously, more crazy chicks need tasers, they're just so practical.
うちの学校では常日頃から常備しておくようにって。
That makes sense to me.
Thus, we've reached the actual poster girl for the series, and the harbinger of 1001 memes. And really, Rena has earned her top spot in this series, as there's just so much to like about her, from her great design, her massive machete, and of course, just her general badassery. Some also see her as one of the major forerunners to the popularity of yandere, which she did kind of do by starting up conversations and everything. But, and yes, I do have to be a little bit pedantic here in order to do a proper analysis, Rena isn't exactly a yandere, but more of a close cousin in the form of a yangire. A yandere's motivations for their psychotic episodes are out of love for someone, like in the case of Shion and Satoshi, hence why I consider her to be the best yandere in this series. Meanwhile, the gire in Yangire refers to a snap, like something in someone's mind snapping, leading into dangerous mental breakdowns. Stuff like stress or depression that is built up over time before it reaches its boiling point. In general, Yangire tend to be a lot scarier than yandere because, let's face it, chances are much higher you're going to run into these types in real life. Now, of course, in some scenarios, you could say Rena was acting out of love for her father and wanted to defend him, but really, that was only a part of her reasoning for her mental instability. Much of it actually came from her mother being an absolutely horrible person who outright cheated on her husband and even had the gall to ask her daughter to come with her and her new daddy. As a result, Rena ended up blaming herself for letting her parents' marriage fall apart, even though really, what could she have done in that situation? You can't expect to change toxic people like this bitch. Still, it did leave her mentally unstable, and she ended up lashing out at others. There might have been other reasons why she attacked her classmates that were retconned in later, but really, this video is running long as is, so let's not overcomplicate things more than necessary. But yeah, Rena had one of the saddest and yet most realistic depictions of a teenager having a mental breakdown, being expelled, forced to see a therapist, and even take medication. How often does that happen in anime? And yet, what puts her in my top 3 was how she recovered afterwards. After moving to Hinamizawa, she developed a much more innocent and gentler persona to mask her past aggressions, and most of all, changed her name. Probably not legally by the looks of it, but she did have almost everyone around her identify her as Rena rather than her birth name of Reina, the name Mommy Dearest gave her. Yes, much like Shion, she sought to separate herself from the family that she could no longer accept as such. A little change like this went a long way in making her a far more amiable person. As a result, she became a protagonist that managed to overcome the Hinamizawa syndrome in all but one of the original 8 story arcs. Not one of the original 8, plus we're not completely sure what happened there, so let's not discuss it just yet. But yeah, on that note, let's talk about that OG arc. This right here still remains one of the most powerful moments in this series for me, as in spite of Keiichi completely losing it by this point, Rena still found it in herself to forgive and even try to help Keiichi because she could recognize he was suffering. In general, in spite of how she usually acts, this girl is really damn perceptive. And while she can, and has lost it on several occasions, that just shows how fallible she is, making her a very well-layered and complex character. Rena Ryugu is and always will be the character most associated with this series, and while that doesn't make her tops on my list personally, there's no denying that she's had a significant impact on the anime industry as a whole thanks to her famous words. And that certainly is no lie! What? I had to do it, it's pretty much a requirement, okay? Oh yeah, you better believe this kid with the weird laugh is my guy. Until things go south, Cage is often just the embodiment of pure fun. He has a ton of great, over-the-top, otaku-related speeches that make surprisingly logical sense when you stop and think about them. And of course, as a less voyeuristic Tomoki Sakurai, he also does do a lot of spicier jokes, though I don't think he ever goes too far, especially considering who's in this group of friends. But yeah, speaking of those friends, I love how dedicated he is to them. You could even argue the times he does succumb to the Hinamizawa syndrome is because he cares about them that much that any signs of betrayal really got to him. Though, even before he moved to Hinamizawa, he had to learn some really hard lessons about how to properly treat others. Because, as it turned out, he once ended up hurting someone, a little girl in fact, after accidentally hitting her in the eye with a BB gun. All of this just because he kind of wanted to rebel against his parents and the society that placed a ton of pressure on him after they discovered he was gifted in that his thought processes were more complex than other kids. Yeah, I'll fully admit, one of the main reasons Keiichi holds the runner-up spot for me is for more personal reasons, as it is heavily implied he has autism, which I can relate with. As I've mentioned in the past, I have Asperger's syndrome, and while it's never really stated what Keiichi has, he did take a test designed to classify mental disorders, and really, wouldn't it make too much sense for somebody with autism to be susceptible to a violent brain parasite? And unfortunately for our young protagonist, he was already halfway there, as even though he was moved to the advanced class, he was still bullied for being too smart and ended up being ostracized by everyone else. I can tell you that really is a thing, if you do end up going to a special ed school. But while I can't say I never had a significantly violent episodes, I'll also admit I had a hard time controlling my temper. Thus, I can't even imagine how Cage felt after these tragedies. So, while I really didn't notice his possible autism as a kid, seeing Keiichi overcome his issues was still really inspiring for me. While a certain someone else did end up becoming the actual main character of the series later, he still did end up leading his friends towards victory, all the while making his weird laugh. Keiichi just barely missed the top spot for me, but really, I don't want to just give that spot to someone who reminds me of myself, though at the same time he does have a lot of objectively great traits. Still, I think there's only one character that can take the top spot on this list. Though before we get there, a quick recap. Number 13, Mamoru Akasaka. Number 12, Natsumi Kimiyoshi. Number 11, Mio Takano. Number 10, Tatsuyoshi Kasai. Number 9, Sadako Hojo. Number 8, Tomoe Minai. Number 7, Crowdo Oishi. Number 6, Mion Sonozaki. Number 5, Hanyu. Number 4, Shion Sonozaki. Number 3, Rena Ryugu. And number 2, Keiichi Maibara. I'll say right now, not only do I think this character is my favorite in this particular series, not only do I think this is Yukari Tamura's best performance in her long and incredible career, but Rika Furide might very well be one of my favorite anime protagonists of all time. First of all, I just love how smug she can get, almost bordering on trolling. And yet she's able to perfectly switch between that and a stereotypically cutesy loli character at the turn of a dime. It's both hilarious and yet awesome at the same time. And yet, as entertaining as this two-faced fake loli is, I also think this lays the groundwork for a really inspiring character. I mean, I think it goes without saying that Rika went through an arduous journey all just to reach the next day on her calendar. For me, ever since I saw Back to the Future, I've always been fascinated by tales of time travelers, especially the ones trapped in Groundhog Day loops. Not just for the science fiction implications, though those are interesting too, but I always like to see how hopping timelines can psychologically affect the traveler. No matter how strong-willed they try to act, everyone will eventually succumb to the despair that comes from the knowledge that they can never actually move forward and might even have to see those closest to them leave first. That to me is almost too horrific to imagine, and yet I can't take my eyes off of this stuff. Rika has probably suffered one of the worst cases of this scenario, being forced to not only suffer her own horrible fate every time, but also had to watch as her friends would often destroy each other all over the course of at least 100 years. It's no wonder she would develop such a cynical attitude in spite of not even making it out of elementary school. But of course, she wasn't always like this either. To me, one of the saddest and yet most powerful moments in all of Higurashi came from the final Kira OVA. You know, the otherwise really upbeat and fun series of OVAs that also brought us the Magical Girl episode and this. But yeah, as one of the last Higurashi anime we got for a while until we got Outbreak and later Go, it featured an even younger Rika from before the first time loop, traveling to the post-Matsuri Bayashi timeline. As a result, we got to see how this Rika was identical to our current one's persona, as if the current Rika had to put on that persona in order to have some attachment to her past self and maintain her sanity. And eventually, they did have to return the past Rika home, knowing full well what awaited her, and yet... As much as I do appreciate the current Go series, I also really wish Higurashi could just have ended here and on such a powerful message. Chances are likely we're all going to go through some difficult times and hardships, and yet we should never try to deny that they happened and how they shaped us into our current selves. It just really goes to show how much Rika has gone through and the sort of fortitude she has built. Yes, she had some breakdowns and even became outright pessimistic at times, but really, who could blame her? And yet, she was still able to find those little shards of hope and the strength to stand up again. Eventually, she found enough to create a world where no one would have to lose, even those who had wronged her for so long. From the very beginning, and even when Keiichi was more the focus, this century-old time traveler was the binding force that kept the club together and turned in the strongest overall performance in the series. Rika's journey, and by extension, the whole story of Higurashi no Nakoroni, is the sort of tale that I think a lot of us need to take in right about now. As everyone and everything in our lives become more connected like some tightly knit backwater village, we will have to deal with many syndrome-inducing stresses. Be it the paranoia generated by the mass media, the high expectations of our families, or even lose those close to us, we have to accept all of that is inevitable and not let it dominate our lives. We should learn from them and grow stronger, perhaps alongside any friends we might have nearby. And while, admittedly, miracles won't come every day, there is at least some merit to look for them, even in some of the most difficult of times. Keeping all of that in mind will make the next day come a lot easier. By the time this comes out, it should be Halloween 2020, which, yeah, I doubt there's going to be any sort of trick-or-treating, though I do hope you end up celebrating in some sort of safe and fun way. For me, though, I'm going to get right to work on my next batch of videos, starting with my Symphogear Axis review for November, followed by maybe some more pre-cure analysis videos. Look forward to all of that, and until then though, farewell for now my friends, and yeah, I think it's about time I let those little guys out.